Hello and welcome to the nervous system part 5. In this video we will be discussing the brainstem and the diencephalon. So this video is the last video in the set of the nervous system playlist. So first, the brainstem is found under the diencephalon, and it helps to connect the cerebrum and spinal cord together to provide a pathway for sensory impulses that travel from the brain to the spinal cord. So basically, the brainstem is a major part of communication for various sensory impulses throughout the entire body. And additionally, this brainstem controls many involuntary functions. As we discussed earlier, involuntary functions are things that you cannot control, such as temperature regulation, respiratory rate, sleep, heartbeat, things like that. So, next, we're going to talk about the various structures in the brainstem. So the first structure is known as the pons. So the pons are basically the bridge that connects the cerebellum, which is located at the back of the head, to the other parts of the brain. As we discussed in the past video, the cerebellum is responsible for controlling equilibrium and the body's balance. Additionally, the pons control respiration and is involved in the communication process. So, it's important to realize that even though the brain has many structures, there are a lot of structures that share the same function. For example, we have a lot of parts of the brain that control respiration. It is not just the pons. So that next we have the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata aids in connecting again the brain and spinal cord. It's also another pathway for conducting neural signals and regulates involuntary functions such as blood pressure, breathing, body temperature, things like that. So, as I mentioned earlier, structures can have the same function or control the same thing. So, as you see here, the pons and the medulla oblongata both control respiration or breathing. Next, we have the midbrain. So, the midbrain is basically the pathway for neural impulses as they move through the spinal cord. So, the earlier parts connected the brain and spinal cord. Now the midbrain is basically a pathway as the impulses move through the spinal cord. Next, we have the diencephalon. So, the diencephalon is located under the cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain. So, the diencephalon involves many brain structures that are crucial basically through observing the environment through the senses. And we'll discuss the parts again later in the next slide. So, the diencephalon regulates things like sleep patterns and controls various involuntary functions, as we discussed earlier. So, the body has a biological clock called the circadian rhythm, which basically helps to regulate sleep and release melatonin, which is the hormone released for sleep. So, these are the diencephalon structures. We have the hypothalamus, the thalamus, and the pineal gland. So first, the hypothalamus is located underneath the thalamus, this part controls the ANS, which is the autonomic nervous system. So the ANS, as we discussed in an earlier video, the ANS regulates involuntary functions which we don't have control over, such as blood pressure, temperature, and the last one is very important, hormone regulation. The hypothalamus is the main part of hormone regulation, but we'll discuss this further when we learn about the endocrine system. Next, we have the thalamus, which is located above the hypothalamus. So, the thalamus relays messages from the sensory organs, such as the eyes and the ears, to the cerebral cortex, which we talked about is the outermost layer outside the brain that contains gyri and sulci. And the thalamus basically aids in the processing and learning of new information. So, the thalamus is very important in learning and things like that. So next we have the pineal gland. The pineal gland is basically the easiest gland to learn. So basically all the pineal gland does is secrete melatonin, which is a hormone that regulates the body's sleep patterns known as a circadian rhythm, or a biological clock. So if you look at the words hypothalamus and thalamus, you'll see that hypothalamus has hypo in front of it. Hypo is a prefix which basically means under or beneath. As we look here, or decreased even, as we see, the hypothalamus is located underneath the thalamus, hypo. So these things are called word parts, and word parts are very influential in learning about medicine and medical terminology and things like that. So, question time. What hormone is secreted by a gland found in the diencephalon that regulates the body's sleep patterns? I'll give you 5 seconds to answer. If you said melatonin, you are correct. So, as we discussed earlier, the gland found in the diencephalon is the pineal gland, which produces melatonin to regulate the body's sleep patterns. So, the first three choices are adrenaline, estrogen, and testosterone. So, the estrogen and testosterone are hormones that are part of the reproductive system, which is not at all the nervous system. So, those choices are out. And then we have adrenaline, which is part of the body's fight or flight response, which again is not. But I will say adrenaline is part of the nervous system. It can be studied in the nervous system, but it does not technically regulate the body's sleep patterns as much as melatonin is. Question 2. Which of the following structures is a component of the brainstem? I'll give you 5 seconds to answer. If you said medulla oblongata, you are correct. So A says hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is part of the diencephalon, not the brainstem. It's located beneath the thalamus and controls basically hormone production and is the main organ involved in hormone production. Then we have the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is not a part of the brainstem or the diencephalon. It is a lobe of the brain, and it's the seat of your personality. We discussed the frontal lobe in a past video. The final part we have is cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain, and this would be incorrect because it's not technically a brainstem portion, as much as the medulla oblongata is, which controls involuntary functions such as breathing. The final question is, which component of the brainstem is known as the bridge connecting the cerebellum to the other parts of the brain? I'll give you 5 seconds to answer. If you said A, pons, you are correct. So B says the thalamus, which again is part of the diencephalon, which is not part of the brainstem. And it's important to note that pons is basically a bridge that connects basically two parts of the brain. So pons would be the answer. And then we have C, which says kidneys, which is not at all part of the nervous system. It's part of the urinary system, and it basically filters the blood and cleans the blood and takes away all the waste products, which is transported into the urine. So that wouldn't be correct. And then we have the diencephalon, which is the other part of the two parts of the brain. And this would be incorrect because the pons are not a part of this diencephalon. So the answer in this case would be pons, which is the bridge connecting the cerebellum, which is in the back of the head, to the other parts of the brain. Thank you so much for watching and stay tuned for the next video.